Cain killed his brother Abel, was cursed by God, and fled east of Eden. But then suddenly, the text tells us Cain knew his wife, and she bore a son, and he built a city in the land of Nod. What the heck is going on here? Welcome back to Dry Bones. Today, we are going to be looking at this story from the Bible to see if the archaeological comes alongside the biblical. And in doing so, we will explore from the viewpoint of a literal story, metaphorical story, or a mythological story, maybe, even perhaps. So before we go on, make sure you click that like and subscribe button. Hi, my name is Kathleen. I have a master's in anthropology with an emphasis on archaeology. I'm also a Christian, and if you were to put me in a box, you would most easily say that I am an old earth creationist-ish. I also have evolutionist views-ish. So I also just want to let you know that is my bias up front. I like to talk about how we need to be up front with our bias. So that's my bias up front. I like to let you know at the beginning. So I've always believed that you don't have to check your faith at the door to be a scientist, and you don't have to ignore science to be a Christian. So this podcast is a space where those two worlds can have a conversation. It is a place where you don't have to leave your brain or your faith at the door. So my last video was out of Africa, and in that video I put a plea out to young earth creationists to take up this question about Cain and his wife and who in the heck were these other people that he was afraid of, but to take on it in a scientific manner. I hadn't really planned to do this video myself, to be honest, but a friend of mine happened to bring up this question. Even he didn't know I had already brought it up in my last video because I hadn't put it out yet. And so I think it just made it just like sit on my brain for a while, and I just grew more and more curious about it. So I decided that it would be my next video. I also thought when I started doing it that it was going to be a really short video because I thought, well, there's not going to be much out there, because there's not a lot of research. And how do you put that research together? You know, do you say, yep, these bones belong to Cain, these bones belong to, oh, see that crush on his head, that's Abel. You know, you can't find that kind of stuff. So I wasn't really expecting much. I was also thinking, oh, this will just be a short one, I'll do it, I'm gonna go visit my daughter, it'll be great, it'll be really short. And then I started researching. And I started asking other people for just some input, like, hey, could they help direct me and guide me to where I could find some information on it? And yeah, there was a lot of rabbit trails, like so much so I really had to cut out stuff to do it. So just so you guys know, there's a lot here, but it's even cut out a lot. And then right before I was getting ready to video this, I suddenly came across a young earth creationist who did a video about it. So I'm going to put that video in the link. It was from a podcast called New Creation Clips. So I'd not heard of that one before. It was new to me. And so I put that link in the description for you guys in case you want to go look at it a little bit more. So back to our question. So this single passage, it's found in Genesis 4, and it raises some of the biggest questions about human origins, and even a little bit of how we read, not even a little bit, and even like how we read scripture. So we're going to delve into one of these oldest mysteries in the Bible. It's at the beginning. Who was Cain's wife? What was in the land of Nod? And who in the heck was Cain so scared of? So first, let's read the text. So most of you guys know the story about Cain and Abel. Cain kills his brother Abel. Cain is the firstborn of Adam and Eve. Abel is the secondborn of Adam and Eve, at least as we understand it. And I'll bring up some extra biblical stuff later. But then we get to Genesis 4, 9 through 17. I'm going to read this for you. It says, "Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Where is your brother Abel?' 'I don't know,' he replied. 'Am I my brother's keeper?' The Lord said, 'What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer, keep that word in mind, on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. But the Lord said to him, not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. Now, just a really quick little note there. This is not the Enoch, if you are familiar with the Bible, this is not the Enoch that we see that is of the line of Seth, who is Adam and Eve's other son, next son. Enoch was a good guy, really good guy. This Enoch, not so much. So here's the key problem, right? Cain kills Abel. He fears being killed by others. He takes a wife, builds a city. So if Adam and Eve were the first people, who exactly was Cain afraid of? And where did he find a wife? Was the land of Nod a real place? And how were there enough people on the earth at that time to build a city? So in order to answer these questions, I looked at them, at each of them in the context of 4 different viewpoints. Now, I couldn't look at all of them in this context, but as much as possible, I tried to look at them all in the traditional explanation, the archaeological considerations, a metaphorical explanation, and a mythological connections, any mythological connections that there might be. And so first, let's look at a timeline from the book of Jubilees. I wanted to do this to give us a certain level of context. Now, the book of Jubilees, if you've not heard of it, it's not a canonized book of the Bible, except by Ethiopian Orthodox. So that means that it's not a part of what at least Western Christians would put into the inerrant word of God. It's more like, I asked my pastor about this, it's more like a commentary on the Bible. So, and that's apparently how early Jews would look at the book of Jubilees. So it's not inerrant, but it can give us insight. And so I just want to make sure that's put in context. So it was written about in the 2nd century BC or BCE, depending upon how you like to say that. So likely between 170 and 105 BC. The authorship is unknown. And here's an interesting thing. So in the book of Jubilees, it'll use the term a week. And that week is 7 equals 7 years. So it's a period. A week is the same as a 7-year period. And then a jubilee is 49 years or 7 weeks. So it uses years with the postfix of AM, meaning Latin for in the year of the world. So creation is the 0 point. So here I'm going to show you this timeline, and I wanted to explain that so you understood the timeline. So years 64 to 70, Cain was born, and then 71 to 77 AM, Abel was born. So this makes him 7 to about 13 years younger than Cain. And then you have their sister Awan born, according to the book of Jubilees, that's not in the Bible, between 78 and 84 AM. So this makes her about 8 to 14 years younger than Cain. And also she was born prior to Cain killing Abel. Just trying to put it all in context. So in 99 to 105 AM, Cain slew Abel. So this puts Cain about in his 30s and Abel about in his 20s. And then 1:30 AM, we see Seth was born. So this is 25 to 31 years after Cain slew Abel. It's 53 to 59 years younger than younger than Abel, and 60 to 60 years younger. So that's right. Okay, so this makes him about 53 to 59 years younger than Abel, and about 60 to 60 years younger than Cain. So I'm perfectly okay if you guys want to check my math. Math's not my strong point. So if you want to check my math and tell me I'm wrong on those, but I think that at least gives us a little bit of a good guideline and context for that. So then we have in 1:34 to 1:40 a.m., another daughter, Azura, was born. And then in 1:90 to 1:96 a.m., Cain took Awan as his wife. And then they had Enoch. That puts it 91 to 97 years after, so almost 100 years after Cain slew Abel, he takes Awan, his sister, as his wife, and they had Enoch. So that would have also put Cain at about 126 to 132 years old, and Awan would have been 118 to 112 years old. So both of them well into their hundreds when they get married and have Enoch, according to the book of Jubilees. So it says that in about 197 a.m., then we see houses being built, and that's when Cain builds a city, and he names it after his son Enoch. And so if you look at that, it was very shortly after Cain took Awan as his wife that they had Enoch, and then at about right after that, the houses were built, and Cain builds this city. And then coming back to Adam and Eve, it says Eve bore 9 sons. Now the book of Josephus says, I think, I didn't write this one down, I think he says that Adam and Eve ended up having, I think, like 33 sons and like around 30 daughters, somewhere in that ballpark. But Book of Jubilees says that in 2:25 to 2:31 a.m., Seth takes Azura, so another sister, to be his wife. So Seth is about 95 to 101 years old. Azura is 85 to 91 years old. And then in 2:35 a.m., Seth and Azura have Enos, which is about 4 years plus or minus after marrying. I wanted to put all those in context, and later on we're going to talk about that because I wanted you to see these time spans that things were happening. So let's get to answering these questions. Who was Cain's wife? So the traditional explanation, this one I found like all over the place. Traditional explanation, because the Bible doesn't name her, is that it was a sister or a niece. It does say in Genesis 5:4, Adam had other sons and daughters. So according to this take, the only people on the earth were Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, and Adam and Eve's other children. And so that early population growth required sibling marriages. And so anthropologically speaking, in very early human populations, there was marriage between close relatives. So it wasn't unusual. It was necessary for survival. Many early societies practiced what they call, and I think I'm pronouncing this, endogamy, which is marriage only within the same community, clan, or tribe. Britannica says it's the custom enjoining one to marry within one's own group. So while that feels really strange and icky to us today, Cain marrying a close relative does fit both the biblical narrative and what we know about small early human communities. Another storyline is that Cain's wife is, again, his sister, but this is a little bit more actually icky. So Abel was promised a wife, which was Cain's twin sister. And so this also lends to the story of why Cain killed Abel. And so according to Midrashic tradition from the Midrash, which is an ancient exeget, which is like an explanation or interpretation of the text, it says that Cain and Abel each had twin sisters, and each was to marry the other's sister. So Abel's promised wife, according to the Midrash, was Aklama. Abel's promised wife, Aklama, was more beautiful than Awan, who was Cain's promised wife. And so Cain would not consent to this arrangement. Adam suggested seeking God's blessing by means of a sacrifice. And so whoever God blessed would marry Aklama. Yeah, kind of icky and kind of very weird for us today. Part of the story is saying this is when Cain and Abel went out and offered this sacrifice to God to try to get an answer for who was going to marry Achlama. And so when God openly rejected Cain's sacrifice, this is what threw Cain into this fit of jealousy and anger, and what made him kill his brother. What's interesting is we also see this same basic story in chapter 19 of 1 Maccabean. I think it was Maccabean, from the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. So in this text, Cain, again, kills Abel because he desired Abel's wife. So two of these sort of extra-biblical books give us that same type of story. Still a sister, but a little bit more about why about the sacrifice that was offered, that the Bible doesn't really give us a lot of clues into why God accepted one sacrifice but not the other. So that's kind of interesting. Again, extra biblical, not inerrant word, according to how Christians, at least Western Christians, see the Bible. All right. So something to think about, too, with this idea of them marrying their sisters and all that sort of stuff is you need to remember, too, that genetic concerns weren't an issue yet. The DNA would have been really pure. It would have been, if any mutations, it would have been very few. So they wouldn't have had to fix each other, kind of a thing. Even if those genetics of Adam and Eve were changed and mutations happened because when they became mortal, it was still too early in that bloodline for mutations to be an issue. So I just have some questions, not really answers, but looking at these time frames, looking at this, did Cain take his wife with him when he left? But then did they wait almost like 100 years to have children? So that's kind of odd. Was Awan sent away later and then found Cain in the land of Nod? So maybe she rebelled somehow, or maybe she was sent out there to help Cain populate. I don't know. Did she just have a really close relationship with her brother Cain and wanted to go, 100 years later, decide to go give him company? I don't know. But also keep in mind, the sister is not mentioned in the Bible at all. Even though a lot of people say it's the sister, it's again just an assumption. So quick note before we head on to other possible notions of who Cain's wife is. To say that Cain's wife is his sister is to make an assumption and add to the text. Two things the reason why I'm pointing that out, two things. One is because when I was researching this, obviously, I was asking a lot of Christians, I was asking a lot of scientists, and, there were some Christians that were concerned about me adding to the Bible, but I'm not any more than somebody saying that it's his sister, because that's also adding to the Bible. It's just, we're just trying to figure out what makes the most sense. That's all we're doing here. What makes the most sense, because God doesn't give us the answers in these. It wasn't part of why he gave us this story. It just had nothing to do with it. So that's one thing that's kind of fun about science, is just to kind of look into how did God do these things. And then my second point I want to make with that is that in the same way, because I hear a lot of young earth creationists. In fact, I just listened to Ken Ham say that there was a sister. There's a lot of young earth creationists that get upset at scientists for making assumptions about dating methods because of how we see, the principle of uniformitarianism. And so I just want to point out that in the same way we want to make an assumption, and not just this story, a lot of stories in the Bible, we want to see what makes the most sense, what's the most reasonable. When scientists make assumptions, we're looking at what is the most reasonable, what makes the most sense. So in the same way as this. So I probably went way too far off on that one, but I just wanted to make that point. So let's go on to more of an archaeological viewpoint. So let's think if Eden was already in the land of Nod. In my mind, I wonder, was she another hominin? did God create other hominins that aren't mentioned in the Bible? And when I'm saying hominin, in case this is your first video with me, I'm talking about the genus Homo. So, I mean, that there's more hominins than just the genus Homo, but that's what I'm referencing. Well, I take that back, because I'm also wondering if Australopiths could have been included in this story as well. But overall, was she another hominin? And did God create other hominins that aren't mentioned in the Bible? Because there's a lot of stuff that he leaves out in the Bible. He leaves out more information about the land of Nod. So he leaves out who Cain's wife was. So is it possible that she was another hominin? And by Cain marrying her, so in our genetics and in the fossil record, we see that there is this intermingling and this change of these hominins, right? And we're going to explore that a bit more when we start talking about the people Cain was afraid of, but I'm just going to go ahead and slide that in there, because that's also who maybe his wife was. And if it was other hominins, it also helps to explain Cain's fear of others and having this ready-made wife out there. Now we can look at it as a symbolic or theological kind of reading into it. This will be explored a bit more later, but some scholars do see Cain's wife was not literal, but represented humanity at large. And I guess so that would make it metaphorical, symbolic. My thought on that is that God goes on to tell us about Cain's descendants. So unless it's talking about just he goes off and marries the world and then the descendants, so that he does have a wife in there, but Cain's wife in general was more about the world out there. He's marrying the world. He's marrying the materialistic side of things, humanity over God. All right, let's look at the land of Nod. Now, the traditional explanations of the land of Nod, as it says in the Bible, it was a land east of Eden. Not much more than that to explain it. But in all seriousness, many read it as an actual region east of Eden, and Mesopotamia has come up as one. You know, another thought is that he was cast away from his family into this area east of Eden, but then only later did it become called the land of Nod, so that when that was written, the people at that time would know where it was referencing, but we just don't know anymore. At some point, that name of it went away. All right, so before we kind of move further, I want to talk a little bit and make some definitions about metaphors and myths. And of course, this just gives me an excuse to put up a few definitions, because I think in general, most of you guys do understand the difference between metaphor and myth, but I think it's helpful as we discuss this to give a little bit more clarity on what they are. And so if you were to define metaphor would be a figure of speech in which one thing is described in terms of another to highlight similarity or symbolic meaning. For example, time is a thief. Well, time doesn't literally steal, but the metaphor conveys how time can take away opportunities. And then the purpose of metaphors is to create a vivid imagery. It deepens the meaning. It allows abstract ideas to be like kind of more understood through these concrete images. And then if we look at metaphor in the Bible, so an example of that would be, the Lord is my shepherd in Psalms 23. So this is saying God cares for his people as a shepherd cares for sheep. And then another one would be, your word is a lamp to my feet in Psalms 119, 105. So this is a metaphor for God's word guiding us like a light in the darkness. So metaphors don't really require the story itself to be like a myth. They can appear in poetry, prophecy, even in historical narratives. All right, so let's look at myth. So the basic definition of a myth is a traditional story, often involving gods, heroes, origins, that expresses the worldview, values, or explanations of a culture. So it's not the same as a falsehood. In academic and literary use, myth doesn't simply mean a lie. It refers to a meaning-making story that communicates truth. That truth could be moral, symbolic, cultural, or spiritual, and it doesn't matter whether or not it's historically factual. So, for example, the Greek myth of Prometheus stealing fire explains human progress and suffering. The Genesis creation story is often called a biblical myth. You don't have to agree with that, but I'm using it as an example. It's often called a biblical myth in the sense of an origin story. So some other uses of myth in the Bible. So in scholarly use, myth equals a sacred origin story that explains identity, purpose, and meaning. Genesis 1:11 is often called mythic history because it deals with beginnings, like the creation, the fall, the flood, the Tower of Babel. The goal is not bare chronology, but theological meaning. So for examples, we have Adam and Eve. And so Adam and Eve could explain sin, mortality, and humanity's relationship with God. Or we have Noah's flood, where this could be a story of judgment and mercy. There's a lot of other ancient flood myths, so it could be echoing those as well. And so where myth and metaphor might overlap is that myths often employ metaphor. So for example, the Garden of Eden, was it a real garden? Or a metaphor for innocence, intimacy with God, and humanity's loss of paradise. And metaphors can help myths teach truth. So for instance, the serpent. Maybe not only was it a literal creature, but also a metaphor for temptation and deception and evil. And in Genesis, many stories function both as mythic origin stories and metaphoric, teaching spiritual truths. And I think it's important to point out that by calling a story in the Bible a metaphor or a myth doesn't make them less powerful. And I think a lot of people think it does. If it is the Word of God and if this is how He's talking to us, He has a powerful lesson in there for us. And sometimes what might happen is that we look into these stories, and at one point in our life, we look at them in a literal way and they teach us something. And then as we change and grow through life, or different things come into our lives, and we look at them again, and this time we look at them as a metaphor, and suddenly we see them as another lesson or powerful explanation of who God is. And neither one of those are less powerful than the other. It's just different ways of God talking to us. And that's what's so wonderful about the Bible, is all the different ways God talks to us through the Bible and how He talks to us as individuals. And He can use these same stories in different ways to teach us more about Himself. So I just want to put that out there, that by saying it's a myth or a metaphor doesn't give it any less power. At least in my opinion, it doesn't. Let's go back to our discussion on the land of Nod and how some might put it in the realm of metaphor or myth. And this is where, again, I think there is a powerful argument for God making a lot of these as a metaphor or myth, because the land of Nod in Hebrew means wandering. That's why I wanted you guys to make that point when I was reading the scripture, and he talks about wandering. And so Nod actually does mean wandering. It means exile. And what I've read more fully of the word means staggering with fear, agitated with apprehension. Because you would want to think, why in the world would somebody name the land Nod when it means wandering? It's just sort of a weird name to name something. But if you put it into this understanding that it was named that for a purpose and a reason, and it means wandering, and that's where Cain was sent out of, it gives you a whole new little look on that. That could be metaphor. So it's possible that it's not actually even a literal land, but a theological idea. So Cain lived in this land of wandering. Also, this is more commonplace, I think that people know this, but the term east in the Old Testament, it typically was a reference to away from God. So when Cain went to Nod, he went east and he went away. So it can be this life apart from God, is what the text could be saying there. Nod could have been a place where he was separated from God, maybe not a literal place, but it could be a state of spiritual being where he was separated from God in a way that we can feel separated from God when we sin without confession and repentance. Because think about that. Cain does not repent after he kills his brother. He just reacts out of fear, and he begs God to save him, even though he didn't save his brother. And even initially, he has this sarcastic attitude in his response to God, like, am I my brother's keeper? Cain shows no level of repentance there. And then when Cain does go out, we see his lineage continue to indulge in this darker side of humanity. We see Lamech, not the father of Noah. That's another question for another time. Why are there so many people named the same thing? Especially this early in humanity. So different Lamech, not the father of Noah. Lamech was the first in the Bible to have 2 wives. So he's the first one to indulge in polygamy. And then he brags of murdering someone. And not only does he murder someone, he takes it upon himself that when God said that somebody who killed Cain, the vengeance would be 7-fold, Lamech takes it upon himself, as if he is God, to say that if Cain's vengeance was 7-fold, his would be 77-fold. So you see Cain's lineage continue to just not turn back from the slide into this dark side of humanity. So was this land of Nod metaphorically splitting the good and evil side of humanity? So Eden might, like Eden symbolized good, land of Nod symbolized evil. Some take this viewpoint and believe that Nod wasn't real because it's never mentioned again in the Bible. And instead, it's a story of a life of self-centeredness and sin. And it's a life without purpose, this wandering, this life without purpose. It's a life of monuments to self, but not of the lasting legacy that we see on Seth's side. And this kind of life, it leads to one of wandering, trying to find purpose when we get separated from God's purpose. So let's get back to our questions. The city, the city that Cain builds. So the literal city, what we can look at is the fact that it does say, if we go back to our literal look at this, it's east of Eden. This term city, it might mean just a settlement or some sort of like fortified camp where just the family was. In Genesis 4:17, the Hebrew word for city is Ir. It means a settlement, town, or fortified place. So it's possible that it's not a large metropolis, as I think people tend to think of it. And especially if you've seen some of the videos I've seen, it's funny what AI is doing to videos these days. I'll just say that. So if this was not a large metropolis, then maybe it could have just been Cain, his wife, and whatever children they had. I will say Josephus, I don't know if you've read Josephus, I think it's Flavius Josephus, a very famous historian, refers to it in terms of a fortified city. The book of Jubilees says that they didn't get married till they were close to 100, though. So at that rate, and at that rate that we saw the kids being born, I don't know if their descendants would have had enough time to grow big enough to actually have this settlement. It seems more likely that for a city to be built, even a smaller one, it would make more sense that there were other people already in the land of Nod. Getting back to this idea of the maybe a theological point of also this Cain building the city, it was often seen as an attempt to defy God's curse of wandering. Instead of accepting his fate as a fugitive, he built walls to anchor himself. In an act of nepotism, he names the city Enoch after his son as an act of self-legacy. This is Cain trying to secure his name after this sin. Josephus expands on the story of Cain, saying that his wickedness continued and brought into human, that's what we were talking about before, that his wickedness continued and it brought into human culture robbery, craftiness, violence from that previous innocence that was seen in Eden. And Josephus also says that this city marked a significant turning point in human history, which does go to that idea that the city of Enoch was much more than just a family settlement. Let's look at the question of Cain's mark, because I think about this one in the context of him going in and making this city. So was Cain's mark a mark that scared others and thus put him in this place of power to lead or possibly even force others to build him a town? And then this idea of how did Cain die? If he had this mark on him and nobody could kill him, how did he die? Well, here's an interesting thing that I read in the book of Jubilees. Cain was actually killed by stones. His house was made of stones and it collapsed on him. And it's an interesting connection to most likely he killed his brother with a stone. And also interesting because his house, I'm sure, was in that city he created and named after his son. So he built this stuff around him and it collapsed on him. That could be metaphor. I mean, that comes from the book of Jubilees. That could be metaphor or it could be true. Could be literal. It'd just be an interesting coincidence. Let's look at it in the archaeological viewpoint. So in the archaeological record, we do see fortified cities that seem to be advanced beyond their time. And that's how a lot of people do seem to have this outlook on this city that Cain built, named Enoch. And so that's why I wanted to bring this up. So the Bible and extra biblical sources mention these skills that came from Cain's descendants. So Jubal was a livestock herder, also calls him a nomad. So that's interesting. So he probably didn't live in that city. But it does sound like he's the one who developed this animal husbandry science that we still use. Jubal, the father of music and inventing instruments. Tubal-Cain was a master blacksmith who worked with bronze and iron. And then we have Enoch, of course, the city that was named after him. And if it was more than a simple settlement, that demonstrates this urban planning and construction skills that they would have had. And then Naamah, that's not in the Bible, but in these other books, it would have been his daughter, and she apparently is said to be an inventor of weaving. Let's look at this from a mythical viewpoint, because I want to look at other cities that also have a mythical outlook on them. And these cities seem to have this unexplained sophistication beyond the expectation of their time frame, and then we see them suddenly destroyed. So one is Göbekli Tepe. I know a lot of people think that a lot of the research done there is pseudoscience. I haven't really fully looked into researching that town. It is something I'm going to do eventually, but I just know a lot of people consider that pseudoscience. When they bring up this, pseudoscience seems to come, the word pseudoscience comes shortly after. But what we think we know of it is that it was built by hunter-gatherers before farming came. And so that would have been really early on. And it seemed to be this place of worship, but there doesn't seem to be evidence of people dwelling there. And then we have Jericho, and of course we see Jericho also in the Bible. And the amazing thing about Jericho, and a lot of people I think that read the Bible don't know in the archaeological record, this interesting thing about Jericho is that it was one of the world's earliest continuous settlements, for this really long-running settlement. And then you have Puma Punko, which is where they say this incredibly precise and complex stonework of these megalithic blocks, some of them weighing over 100 tons. And they fit them together like a puzzle, and there's no mortar being used. And then you have Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. And these have streets that just have this mathematical precision to them and these elaborate water systems. And this is before the pyramids. So it's very interesting to see this advancement, these advanced places. Then you have Cusco in Peru. And this is where we see, again, these stones that are just like locked together without mortar. And these are earthquake proof, which is something we are still working on in this day, is to try to make buildings earthquake proof. And then you have Nan Modal, which is built on an artificial reef. So that's like a testament to its builders' advanced engineering skills that they would have had at that time. And it's just built from these enormous basalt stones that just also, again, weigh many tons. But interesting, all of them eventually are destroyed, which is kind of crazy. All right, let's talk about who were the people. Who were these enemies of Cain? So Cain says to God, he's scared. But what is he scared of? You would think, I'm about to go off into the wilderness. You know, if I went off into the wilderness, I'd be more scared of bears, lions, tigers. I might be scared of people, but I'd really be scared of those beasts. But Cain isn't. He's not scared of the beast. He's scared of people. And with so few people mentioned in the Bible at that point, you would think God would say, Cain, like, it's only the 4 of you guys right now. Like, who are you talking about? He doesn't. He confirms it. He confirms it to the point that he puts a mark on Cain so that nobody will kill Cain. So there is reality there. If you take the Bible literally, metaphorically, whatever, God is agreeing that there are people out there and these people could possibly kill Cain. Now, a lot of people will say that these are his brothers and sisters. And of course, then they would be mad because he just killed their brother. So understandable. Except there's the question of what these would have been younger than Cain. And it would be weird to me that they went out prior to this conflict between Cain and Abel, because remember back to that timeline we discussed earlier, Cain and Abel were pretty young, in their 30s and 20s. So that wouldn't have left a lot of time for these younger siblings to get old enough to go out into this land. And then they would have been younger and most likely weaker than Cain. So then why would he have been so scared of them? Why were they sent out? Does that mean that they were bad? They just wouldn't have been very old. So when you look at these long ages of these people, that emphasizes even more the relative youth of Cain and Abel being in their 30s and 20s when that confrontation happened. Something to think about there. So also, if these dates are correct from the book of Jubilees, it gives context for how often these children were being born. So it looks like they were being born about 7 to 13 years apart at this youngest. And then a lot of times it was like there was 100 years before that next generation was started, because when you look at the ages of people, even just if you look at them in the Bible, they're pretty darn old before they start having children. When we're looking at how fast a population would have grown, we probably can't really look at how fast it would have grown today. And so what comes to mind when I was thinking about this was that show 19 and Counting. And so I did a little math, and it took them 21.5 years to have 19 children. So that's one birth about every year and a half. But according to the Jubilees, that rate was about one every 7 to 13 years at the very least. And Cain, as the oldest child, was only in his 30s when he was sent out. So that doesn't leave a lot of children born, and especially children of an age that could go out and live on their own. So at that rate of population growth, Cain couldn't have built a city with just him and his family. They just would have been too young. There would have been too few of them to actually build a city. Now, a couple of tents, yeah, but it doesn't seem to me that's what the text is referring to, especially if he names it after his son. So a theological look at that was, of these people, could Cain have been the chosen, coming from Adam, and then he mingled with the not chosen? And thus, when Christ came to redeem everyone, he redeemed all of humankind, which makes that lots bigger than just this line from Adam. But kind of like, speaking of that, though, we would have to deal with, the Bible talks about all men came from this one man. And so that's another argument of that would have to be grappled with. There's a lot in there, and this idea of being pre-Adamic. And so Adam, before Adam came along. This idea that there were people that God created before Adam, and then this idea of this first world that comes up that was before what they call Lucifer's flood. So it was this world that God created and then destroyed. And so were there leftover people from that? Could that have been what they are? And so that's why God doesn't mention them, because they were just already there. But I'm going to be honest, that doesn't make sense to me. But it's one of those thoughts that are out there. All right, let's go back to the archaeological look at this, about these being hominins or other people God created. I'm not necessarily talking about pre-Adamic when I'm talking about this. I'm more talking about, did God create Adam as well as all these other hominins? Because God doesn't give us every detail. He doesn't give us an account of every single animal that he created that moves along the land. He doesn't tell us more about the land of Nod, but he felt it important to still mention it. And he knows the intelligence he gave us. He knows the curiosity he gave us. He tells us to question everything. So he had to know that we were going to be like, what's up with this, God? And have some desire to try to figure it out. Which to me is, and I'll talk about this at the end, is more emphasis on there is something much bigger going on here than just this story about Cain and the land of Nod. So some believe that God created these other people, but Adam was the first chosen to have the breath of God in him. And so when you think about this, we have fossils of Homo erectus stretching for almost 2 million years. And I am curious, could Adam and Eve have been Homo erectus? Because if you think about it, these names like Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo naledi, these are just classifications given to the fossils by people, not by God, and all they're classified in is because they have similar traits. In a context like this, they're meaningless as to whether they were Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis. They're still created by God. We know that they're created by God, if you're a believer, because they're in the fossil record. And God has them in the fossil record for us to find for some reason. And that's why this is so exciting. Have I said that already? This is so exciting. Makes me all Twitter-hated. Sorry, I heard somebody use that word the other day, and I thought it was really funny, so I thought I'd use it. Let me get back to my notes here. So if they were early hominins, so like if you go with me on this, let's say Adam and Eve were Homo erectus or some other early hominin. I'm curious if then the people in the land of Nod were maybe Australopiths, or were Adam and Eve Homo sapiens and the people in the land of Nod Homo naledi or Homo floresiensis. I don't know. So okay, I veered off again. If they were early hominins like Homo erectus, so then Babel happens and God spreads everybody out, right? And each one of them adapted to their different environment. And this is why we see the change in their brow, in their brain size, depending upon which, if it's Homo erectus or Australopith or Homo sapiens or whatever, you see the Neanderthals with the larger chest case, like you see all these things. And so as they were adapting to their environments, such as that, is that then how we have these different Homo genus? And so as they continued to roam the earth, then they sort of like ran back into each other and intermingled. And that is how we now have our genetics that show Denisovan and Neanderthal and even ghost populations that haven't even been discovered yet. So now looking at this in a mythological way. So there are mythological towns that were supposedly built by advanced intelligent beings. So some people, that's what they think the land of Nod and this city of Enoch is that sort of like you have Atlantis, not in Greece, but sort of how the Greeks have Atlantis. Sumer have Eridu, Hindu have Lanka, and Egypt has Zep-Tepe. Could it have been a mythological town like that was somehow built by these advanced intelligent beings, but these advanced intelligent beings were actually Cain's kids because they got imbued with some sort of advanced intelligence from some kind of crazy mythological whatever. And at some point I am going to come back to the Nephilim, because that also brings up in this whole land of Nod and this city. So we will talk about that also as well, just not in this one, because as you can tell, there's a lot. I had to take out some stuff, and I had to stop at Nephilim. So, and also another reason for this, to think of this as a mythological, is because when Cain named his town Enoch, and when he named his son Enoch, Enoch means initiated, dedicated, which usually those are terms of sort of like a worship type of thing. And we see Göbekli Tepe and Baalbek being places of worship, but not of a dwelling. So that's another one of those like kind of hints at it being something more than that. To brought up this idea that some of these stories in the Bible were code, because the Romans and the Catholic Church at one point were burning history books. So stories were created as code in order to pass down some of these stories in the Bible. And then maybe we've just kind of like lost that key that tells us what that code was. And so we're in the middle of taking them literal, but they were meant as code. So I thought that was an interesting viewpoint. Not going to go further on that. Okay, then this one. So I didn't know this, but apparently at one point, apparently it's not, they don't anymore, but apparently at some point Mormons thought Cain is Bigfoot. So apparently this comes from an excerpt from The Miracle of Forgiveness by the prophet Spencer W. Kimball, and I'm going to read this. As I was riding along the road on my mule, I suddenly noticed a very strange personage walking beside me. His head was about even with my shoulders as I sat in my saddle. He wore no clothing, but he was covered with hair. His skin was very dark. I asked him where he dwelt, and he replied that he had no home, that he was a wanderer in the earth and traveled to and fro. He said he was a very miserable creature, that he had earnestly sought death during his sojourn upon the earth, but that he could not die, and his mission was to destroy the souls of men. About the time he expressed himself thus, I rebuked him in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, and by virtue of the holy priesthood, and commanded him to go hence, and he immediately departed out of my sight. Apparently that's why they think at some point they thought Cain was Bigfoot. And because I saw this point of Cain being an immortal wanderer and other viewpoints that I've also left out, I want to point out that nothing in the story actually says Cain is immortal or invulnerable. Not in the extra biblical text, not in the biblical text. He was cursed to wander. And God marked Cain so that no one would kill him. Not that no one could kill him. And actually God specified a punishment if anybody did kill Cain. So that means he could die. Just to make that point in case any other things come up about Cain and this making him immortal. All right, so before we go on, please make sure you click that like and subscribe button if you feel others would also enjoy my videos. It would help me a lot and hopefully bring some really good knowledge and information to others that might also enjoy this. Now let's get into my own personal thoughts. Why did God spare Cain when he didn't spare others later? Could this have been God's plan to further populate the world? But if so, why didn't he rid the world of the evil that Cain's lineage continued to create? Possibly was this more of showing us that he gives us a choice. God warned Cain before he killed his brother. He told him, do not sin. He gave him an out. He gave him an out of his temptation. And God does that for us too. He gives us an out of when we are tempted to do something. God says he gives us a way out of that. And we see him giving Cain a way out. He gives him a warning. But Cain chose to ignore God's warning, and he took his brother's life. But even so, God showed him grace even in that dark moment. But even in that grace, he also allowed him to face the earthly consequences of his actions. So we can be forgiven and we can be given grace. But that doesn't mean that the earthly consequences of our actions get taken away. So through protecting Cain, he shows us another level of his grace that he also will give us even when we make bad choices. And so looking at both the biblical text and the fossil record, which is, where I come from, this is my, like I said at the beginning, this is my bias. I'm a Christian and an archaeologist, so I like to look at the biblical text and the fossil record. So looking at both the biblical text and the fossil record is probably, to me, and because remember, I'm an archaeologist and a Christian, is that this land of Nod was inhabited by some other hominin group. We see their skeletons and their DNA in our blood as evidence that they were there. Even if you don't believe in the old earth time frame, you don't have to believe in that to admit that it's possible that they were other hominins. It's just the tricky part of that is, when did God create those other hominids and how did that happen? But I do think that there is room to believe that God is speaking out of a simple story that has a more complicated archaeological record. I think that happens a lot. That he speaks to us in a very simple way, but when we look in the archaeological record, it's a much more complicated story, but still that same story. So the idea that Homo sapiens, or the Homo genus, was the first that God breathed life into is an interesting concept for me. And I'll be honest, I haven't sat with it long enough to know exactly where I land with it, but it does kind of fit. It's just that scientifically, it needs to be scientifically studied. I do believe that too. Me doing this podcast, I don't have any resources to go out there and do actual, dig in the dirt research. I do that for my job, but that's a whole different type of archaeology. Different time frame and all that kind of stuff. This is again another plea, but this could be for old earth or young earth creationists of these organizations that do have the money to go out there and do research, like dig in the dirt research. I would love for you guys to do more studies on these things. Give us some more backing on them. So regardless if you see this story in a literal way, a metaphorical way, a mythical way, or maybe a mix of all of them, as a Christian, I believe it is in the Bible because God wanted us to tell us something through it about himself and about us. And for me, I think he is showing us that he gives us a way out of our sin and that he gives us grace and mercy when we go forward with it anyway, and that Jesus came to redeem us all of our sin. And I think that's pretty powerful when you look at it this way. And you look at God could have just, taken Cain off the face of the earth right after he killed Abel. But he gave him an opportunity to talk to him about it. He even gave him an opportunity to get out of it. And just like he does for us today. So I think that's what it's telling us. And then I think if there's any realism to the story, if he did have it as real, I think that's where we can look at that archaeological record. My last video was on the out of Africa hypotheses that have come out. And so if you are interested in that, because it does deal with this early time frame, you can take a look at it here. You can take a look at it here. You can take a look at it here.